Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, reporting from just outside the Palace of Westminster in central London, where global power, policy and markets intersect. Coming up on today's show, a triple murder in Bedfordshire. A wife and her two daughters found dead in the luxury mansion. The suspect, a British citizen of Zimbabwean heritage, has fled to Zimbabwe, and Britain has no extradition treaty with that country. And Nigel Farage has resigned from Parliament under pressure from corruption probes. He says he will fight a by-election in Clacton on his own terms. Is this the end of Reform UK's most powerful voice, or a calculated gamble? And Prince Harry loses his final legal battle against the Daily Mail. NATO wraps up in Ankara, a Nigerian medical student killed by a Russian airstrike in Ukraine, and the Iran peace deal holding, but only just. Then later, Africa's capital markets moment. The AT50 index, which benchmarks Africa's most listing-ready tech companies, activates at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange next week. I speak with Bite Oduneye of the Africa Tech 50 Index. But first, this week, a quiet street in Bedfordshire became the centre of one of the most shocking murder investigations Britain has seen in years. On Monday, police forced entry to a £1.3 million detached mansion in Greater Denham near Bedford after neighbours reported that the family living there had not been seen for several days. Inside, officers discovered the bodies of three people believed to be Notahabo Zandile Chuma, 42, known as Zandile, and her two daughters, Natalie, 15, and Nala, just 5 years old. Natalie's school described her as a pupil who was full of life and had a positive impact on everyone. Flowers have been laid outside the family home. The suspect is Dodana Makanyisi Tshuma, also known as Mark, aged 45, a British citizen of Zimbabwean heritage. He's a senior IT manager earning around £100,000 a year, who bought the property just 2 years ago. CCTV footage shows him leaving Heathrow Airport on a British passport on Saturday, the 4th of July, 3 days before the bodies were found. He is now believed to be in Zimbabwe. Detective Inspector Lee Martin said, "We know that Mark left the country on Saturday and is now believed to be in Zimbabwe. We are urgently working to find and apprehend him. Criminal investigation knows no borders." There is one critical complication. Zimbabwe does not appear on the United Kingdom's list of extradition treaty partners. Bringing Chuma back to face justice will require diplomatic engagement at the highest level, and there is no guarantee of success. For African diaspora communities across Britain, this is a deeply painful and disturbing story. The victims are from Zimbabwe, the suspect is from Zimbabwe, and the case raises urgent questions about domestic violence, coercive control, and what happens when a man who has everything chooses to take everything away.
I can confirm that we have launched a murder investigation after the tragic and shocking discovery of three bodies at a property in Great Denham near Bedford. This is a deeply distressing incident, and our thoughts are first and foremost with all of those who have been affected. We were called on Monday the 6th of July regarding concerns from a mother and her two children who had not been seen for several days. A number of inquiries were carried out before our officers forced entry into an address in Carnoustie Drive. Upon entry, they discovered the bodies of a woman and her two children. Formal identification will take place in due course. We are in the early stages of what is a very complex investigation, which is being led by detectives from our major crime unit. We are committing all necessary resources to establish exactly what has happened and to find the person responsible. As a result of inquiries undertaken so far, we have identified a suspect who was known to all three victims and who we believe has subsequently left the country. We recognise that this incident will cause concern in the local community and beyond, and whilst there is nothing to suggest that there is any wider risk to the public, we will be increasing our police presence in and around the area to support the investigation and to provide reassurance to local residents. I would ask anyone who may have information about this incident or who may have heard or seen any suspicious activity in Carnoustie Drive, particularly on Friday or Saturday, to please come forward as soon as possible.
And while that murder investigation dominates the headlines here at Westminster, another extraordinary political drama has unfolded. On Tuesday, Reform UK leader Nigel Farage announced on YouTube that he was resigning his seat in Parliament, immediately triggering a by-election in Clacton, the Essex constituency he won in 2024 with a majority of over 8,000 votes. The reason? A growing financial scandal. Farage is currently facing a parliamentary standards investigation over a £5 million gift from Reform donor Christopher Harborne before he became an MP. A further probe is likely after the Sunday Times revealed that George Cottrell, the convicted fraudster jailed in the United States in 2017 for money laundering, recruited and paid 3 staff to work on Farage's social media before the 2024 general election and has continued to let Farage use a 5-storey Georgian townhouse near Buckingham Palace. None of this was declared. Farage denied any wrongdoing, insisting he has not broken the law in any way. He framed his resignation as a deliberate political move, declaring it a people versus the establishment by-election and vowing to stand again in Clacton to seek a fresh mandate from his voters. But his gamble appears to have backfired. Immediately, Labour, the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats, the Green Party and even Restore Britain, the hard-right party founded by former Reform MP Rupert Lowe, have all refused to stand candidates, calling the by-election fake, a gimmick and a pantomime. Kemi Badenoch said Farage was running away from scrutiny and that the real by-election, the one that matters, will take place after the parliamentary investigation concludes. So far, only Count Binface has confirmed he will stand against Farage. The establishment he claims to be fighting has simply declined to show up, and that may be the most devastating verdict of all. And Tuesday brought another blow to those seeking accountability from Britain's most powerful media institutions. Prince Harry was in London this week, attending a Chatham House event for the Invictus Games Foundation, when the High Court delivered its verdict in his landmark privacy case against Associated Newspapers, the publisher of the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday. The Duke of Sussex, alongside 6 other claimants, including Sir Elton John, his husband David Furnish, actress Elizabeth Hurley and actress Sadie Frost, lost their case comprehensively. All 97 allegations against the newspaper group were dismissed by High Court Judge Mr Justice Nicklin, who ruled that the claimants had failed to prove their case. The allegations were serious. They included the interception of voicemails, tapping of landlines, paying corrupt police officers with links to private investigators, faking medical records and bugging celebrity homes. Associated Newspapers called the ruling an overwhelming victory for the Daily Mail and its journalists, and for a free press generally. Prince Harry described the verdict as a whitewash. In a statement, he said, "We came to court seeking justice and accountability, but we have received neither." The ruling adds to what has been a difficult week for the Duke. Meghan, Archie and Lilibet did not join him in London after the government refused to provide taxpayer-funded police protection for the family during the visit, a dispute that has now dragged on for years. Harry founded the Invictus Games, the sporting competition for injured military personnel, and Birmingham hosts the 2027 Games. This week was meant to be about that legacy. Instead, it has been defined by legal defeat and a family still divided. From the courts to the corridors of global power, the 36th NATO summit concluded yesterday in Ankara, Turkey, bringing together all 32 member states for 2 days of high-level meetings at the presidential complex. The Ankara summit declaration was built around a single defining ambition: a stronger Europe in a stronger NATO, sometimes described as NATO 3.0. For Britain, the summit carried a particular significance. Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer attended as a lame duck leader, with Labour leadership nominations open and Andy Burnham set to take over on the 20th of July. Ankara was almost certainly Starmer's last international engagement as Prime Minister. He leaves the world stage quietly, without the authority of a leader with a future, but with the weight of a country that still needs to be represented. The summit's headline achievement: All NATO members are now spending at least 2% of GDP on defence. European allies and Canada spent an additional $139 billion on core defence in 2025 alone, with combined extra spending across 2025 and 2026 reaching $258 billion. Allies announced over $50 billion in new defence procurements and contracts, including up to 10 new surveillance aircraft, a $40 billion counter-drone initiative, and a pledge to train 5 times more drone operators by next year. The new benchmark is 5% of GDP by 2035. On Ukraine, NATO pledged €70 billion in military equipment and training for this year. On Iran, the alliance called on Tehran to respect freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. And on the United States, Trump once again singled out Spain as a terrible NATO partner. For Africa, a better funded, better armed NATO remains a NATO whose attention is fixed firmly on Europe. The continent is watching from a distance. And from the world's most powerful military alliance to the human cost of a war that Africa did not start. Nani Adaobi Marian was just 23 years old, a medical graduate of Kharkiv National Medical University in Ukraine. She had gone to Eastern Europe to become a doctor, to serve her country and her continent. On the 29th of June, a Russian-guided aerial bomb struck the city of Kharkiv. Marian was critically injured. Her friend Fatima was killed at the scene. Marian was then evacuated to Germany for specialist treatment, but despite the efforts of medical teams in both countries, she did not survive. She was not a combatant, she was not a recruit, she was a civilian student, one of thousands of Nigerians and Africans who are in Ukraine pursuing degrees in medicine, engineering and other disciplines. They are caught in a war they had no part in starting and no power to stop. Her death comes at a moment when the presence of African nationals in the Russian-Ukraine conflict is drawing intense scrutiny for a very different reason. Ukraine authorities say at least 215 Nigerians have signed contracts with the Russian Ministry of Defense. Some reportedly lured through fake job offers. That is a separate and deeply troubling story, but it must not be allowed to obscure what happened to Nani Adaobi Marian. She went to Ukraine to learn how to save lives. She deserved to come home. And finally, before the break, a story that has moved dramatically this week and will continue to develop before the end of this program. The US-Iran ceasefire, the June Memorandum of Understanding that brought a fragile end to months of conflict and reopened the Strait of Hormuz, is under severe strain. Overnight on Wednesday, America launched strikes on Iran, targeting air defenses, radars, command sites, coastal assets and Revolutionary Guard boats. Over 80 targets were hit. US Central Command described the strikes as retaliation after Iran attacked 3 commercial vessels, including Qatari and Saudi tankers, in or near the Strait of Hormuz. Speaking on the sidelines of the NATO summit in Ankara, President Trump declared the June Memorandum of Understanding a waste of time and said the US was preparing further action. Iran condemned the strike as a major violation of the ceasefire framework and said it would defend its rights. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte called the US strikes absolutely necessary. Oil prices have spiked. Markets have reacted. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil and gas supply passes, is once again at the center of global anxiety. As you watch this program, the situation in the Gulf will have developed further. What we can say today with certainty is that the peace that Africa's economies so desperately needed has been put back in jeopardy. The energy shock that devastated fuel prices, food costs and public finances across this continent from February to June may be returning. For Nigeria, for Kenya, for Ethiopia and for every African economy that imports fuel, this is a story to watch very closely indeed. Still to come on Channel's Business Global, Africa's capital markets moment. The 8050 index activates at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange this week. I speak with Bite Odunaye of the Africa Tech 50 Index and the biggest business news stories of the week. All of this after the break. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, reporting from just outside the Palace of Westminster in central London, where global power, policy and markets intersect. In a moment, Africa's capital markets. But First, the biggest business news stories of the week. Kenya has taken a landmark step in securing its economic future. President William Ruto signed the Sovereign Wealth Fund Act into law at State House in Nairobi earlier this week, establishing a framework to preserve and invest the country's natural resource wealth for generations to come. The legislation creates 3 separate vehicles, one to cushion the economy against shocks, one to finance priority infrastructure projects, and a future generations component into which 30% of all mineral and petroleum revenues will be permanently ring-fenced. The initial capitalization is estimated at 200 billion Kenyan shillings, drawn from resource revenues and proceeds from the divestment of state assets. Ruto called it a historic milestone. And in a development that speaks directly to why that legislation matters, Africa's richest man has chosen Kenya as the home of his next great industrial project. Aliko Dangote has confirmed that his planned 700,000 barrel per day refinery will be built on the island of Lamu off Kenya's coast. The facility, which will cost an estimated $20 billion and take up to 3 years to build, will be the largest in East Africa and the second largest on the continent, behind only Dangote's own Lagos refinery. It will be financed through internally generated cash, bonds, and a planned initial public offering. Kenya was the choice from the beginning, said Edwin Devakuma, Dangote Industries Vice President for Oil and Gas. For a region that has long depended on imported refined fuel, the arrival of that capacity on African soil is a statement of industrial ambition. And Ghana has settled a $700 million Eurobond obligation ahead of schedule, paying $525.2 million in principal and $174.8 million in interest on the 2nd of July. Ghana has now repaid a total of $2.1 billion to Eurobond holders since January 2025 as part of its IMF-backed debt restructuring program. Finance Minister Dr. Cassio Atto-Forson said the payment was made without undue pressure on Ghana's foreign exchange reserves. 2 West African economies, one building for the future, one honouring its past obligations, both sending exactly the right message to international investors. And now a story about the infrastructure being built to connect Africa's most successful companies to the global capital they deserve. Next week, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, Africa's largest exchange and one of the continent's most important capital market institutions, hosts the first African exchange activation of the 80/50 index. The 80/50 launched at the London Stock Exchange in January, a rules-based benchmark of Africa's 50 most listing-ready private technology companies, including Flutterwave, Moneypoint and Time Bank. Next week's JSE activation is the next milestone in that journey, bringing the benchmark to an African exchange for the first time. The man behind it is Bite Oduneye, founder and managing partner of Odba, an early-stage venture capital fund and a member of the governing council of Indexter Exchange Group. His argument is simple but profound. Africa does not have a capital shortage, it has a capital translation gap. Bite Oduneye, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. Congratulations. The 80/50 index is launching in Johannesburg on the stock exchange next week. Eagle-eyed viewers will remember Channel's Business Global was at the LSE in London at the beginning of the year when you initially launched there. Talk to me about the reasons why you chose South Africa and not the NGX in Nigeria. That's doing phenomenally this year, by the way.
Well, a huge thank you for that, Juliana. It's always a pleasure to be here. Always a pleasure to speak to you. And was really grateful that you attended and covered the launch at the London Stock Exchange. As you rightfully said, the London Stock Exchange was visibility, right? London is one of the international capital cities of the world, so it made sense to launch the index at the London Stock Exchange.
It was a very well turned out event.
Well, it's imperative. If it's been built as capital market infrastructure, you can't build this alone. You've got to build it with the investment banking community that the index has been built for. Now, as you rightfully said, London was the launch. South Africa is our first African activation. Now, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is the largest stock exchange on the African continent, right? By far, about 1.4 trillion US dollars in market cap. So it makes sense for us to launch or start the African activation on the largest exchange that has a lot of experience in capital formation and backing phenomenal innovators. Now, as you rightfully said, we're not just going to be doing South Africa. Of course, we would spread our wings, as is the first African activation. And we will be visiting the EGX in Egypt, the NGX in Lagos, and the NSC in Nairobi as the activations go along. But we thought, for the first activation, considering the 11 companies on the index that are South African, that it did make sense to start out on Africa's largest exchange.
The AT50 includes names like Flutterwave, Moneypoint, Time Bank. I told you the who's who was there in January. I'm sure we're showing some of those pictures now. Companies that most people would already think, look, they're generating millions of customers. Why do Africa's most successful private tech companies still need a benchmark to attract long-term capital?
Well, as you rightfully said, they're the most innovative technology companies on the continent. Built fantastic companies, mega revenues, expansions in a number of jurisdictions. I think I should correct that it's now Go Time Bank. There's been a change in name for that phenomenal company. So it's now, if you think about it, all that was built with venture capital, fast-growing capital. Now, besides venture capital, there's a lot of institutional capital. And that's the capital, longer term in which that capital is good for the companies to have, much more than venture capital could ever dream of. So it really is improving that corporate governance, the visibility of these companies to ensure institutional capital has access to it. In other jurisdictions of the world, say for example, something like SpaceX, NVIDIA, or a number of these fantastic companies, a lot of institutional capital had access to that way before they listed on the market. So what we're attempting to do here with the index is to provide uniformity across the board to ensure that global capital further understands these brilliant companies that are being built, and to ensure that a lot more of this capital goes into backing these fantastic companies.
Let's talk about IPOs more broadly across the continent. Airtel Africa has delayed its mobile money IPOs, I'm sure you're aware, and African tech IPOs remain extremely rare, despite billions flowing into the sector. Does the AT50 address the actual reasons deals like this keep stalling?
Well, no, that would be unfair for me to claim. So the Airtel IPO, for example, has been moved on to 2026. Airtel is one of the most successful companies on the continent, so we're expecting that would happen. IPO stalls for a number of reasons. At the moment, I'm sure it would be the global appetite of things, right? We've got a number of wars going on in the world, currency fluctuation, just uncertainty at a level that's ridiculous. We've not had this in a while, so it would make sense for a company like Airtel to postpone their IPO, because the level of interest or the risk appetite in the earlier part of the year could change considerably. So it does make sense, right? The market was not conducive enough for them to list. So that makes sense. The AT50, I'll be very clear. No, it's not that it makes IPOs better. It doesn't pick, it's not an automatic thing. What it does do, it provides that visibility. And that's what's important, right? And that visibility to global capital, speaking the language of capital, and presenting these businesses the way that global capital wants to see it. And once that happens, we expect to see a lot of this capital flowing in. I won't disclose now, but we're doing a lot of work with a number of banks, and there's a bank in particular that's looking to launch a $500 million ETF strictly for African later stage technology companies. And they're going to be using the AT50 index as a guide as to what companies they will be picking. And that's really right there is the opportunity that benchmarks provide. That once we see a number of these benchmarks, like the AT100 that's launching later on in the year and the AE2000, what it really does, it allows the deal makers, the investment bankers, the financial engineers to really unlock capital that otherwise we have been starved of. And we also think, especially with the technology companies, very similar to any of the companies that have listed on the continent before, majority of these technology companies from day one exist in 3-4 countries. So we think that the technology companies, when the system has been fully developed, we think that we're going to begin to see a number of them listing on their local exchanges, as well as a number of dual listings. We've seen OPay has announced that they will be listing at the NASDAQ later on this year. We've seen MNT Hallan mentioned that they are considering the EGX. So all what the index is supposed to do is just to ensure that it provides a lot more visibility to global capital.
Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today. But as always, do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.